welcome to JJ Atkins Art. I really appreciate you stopping by the channel and taking a look at our newest caricature, Henry Cavill's Superman, in what we're just going to loosely call the classic pose. Now, before we get started, just a quick plug for the channel here. I've recently started a new series of comics just based on some more personal aspects of my life, especially living with my two Boston Terriers, Snoopy and Fudge. I've given this name, we're calling it Invitation to Life, and as I mentioned before, there's a couple of episodes that have already been posted on the channel. I'll put a link up in the upper right-hand corner there, show you a couple samples in the meantime, and encourage you to go ahead and check out that playlist. And also, since I haven't mentioned it yet, make sure you take some time to like, subscribe, and share some of these videos. Make sure we get the word out. Alright, so that being said, let's go ahead and we'll dive into the drawing itself. Just again, don't forget, take a little bit of time and check out some of the other drawings that I have on the channel. I'd really appreciate it. Now let's talk about Henry Cavill and Superman. So in preparing you to take a look at some of the sketches that I've done for this particular caricature, I'd like to state right off the bat here that the word caricature is a word that I'm using a little bit loosely. Caricature is something I really enjoy, and I do it a lot on my site, but sometimes I get a little bit away from the exaggeration and go for more of a portrait feel with some of the drawings that I do. And that wasn't necessarily intentional here, it's just something that kind of happened. So I wanted to offer a little explanation as to the why. Henry Cavill might be easily thought of as someone that's easily caricatured. He does have some features that stand out, like his very pronounced brow, or even his larger eyebrows, and that very square jaw of his. But the reality is that if you match up his face against what we might normally or loosely consider to be the normal face, the thing that we compare it to see what to exaggerate and what is larger or what differs from the norm, the challenge that I had is in finding that he actually kind of conforms to the norm face. And that's kind of an odd thing to kind of point out because it doesn't happen very often. Now, in order to maybe get a little bit of inspiration, I've also checked out some other caricature artists to see how they dealt with Henry Cavill as a Superman type caricature, and kind of found that loosely they were running into the same problems that I was. Some of my favorite caricature artists were having trouble achieving or holding on to a resemblance of Henry Cavill when they were trying to do exaggeration, because he just isn't somebody who can exaggerate. He doesn't really differ from the norm that much. Now, I did try to kind of focus on the elements we could focus on, like, as I mentioned before, the brow line, or even that very distinguishable cleft mark in his chin. But those things aren't enough to build a resemblance on. The resemblance is usually in the eyes and the mouth and the nose. And because they're so very close to what we would consider to be the normal, whatever normal is, it becomes very difficult to decide what to exaggerate and still hold on to some sense of resemblance. So this ended up veering more towards a more literal portraiture rather than caricature because of some of those limitations. And once I kind of discovered it was going that route, you can see what I did with it. I took a more serious kind of a take on the sketch here, where I really softened the shadows to really get an idea of where the contours of the face, especially around the cheeks and the jawline, would set. I had a really good reference photo for this that had a very, very bold lighting scheme on one side of his face, so you can kind of see that represented on the right-hand side. And I really wanted to use the shadow that sat in the middle of his face to really kind of help bring in some of that resemblance that I was losing by some of the small exaggeration that I was doing. So again, this really kind of lent itself more to portraiture than anything else, and that's why I spent so much time on this rough sketches and trying to get more almost like a black and gray value study done before really kind of going in there and attempting my more traditional coloring method. So one might argue that there was some time wasted in trying to get this in depth in the sketch, but it was just something that kind of helped make me comfortable. And once I had that in place, then I could go in and kind of sketch in the body and decide what I wanted to do there. Now, as far as the composition is concerned, I will let you know right off the bat here that the head was something I was going to put together with the body to be added in later, and I hadn't really decided on what pose the body would take. At the end of this, we know that this is going to be that big classic pose where he rips open the shirt and does the big reveal of the Superman suit. But that wasn't something that I decided on initially. I wanted to see if I could get a resemblance in the face before I decided on any sort of a pose the body would take. And once I was relatively happy with the face and I started sketching in some loose idea what shape the body would take, this kind of, again, classic pose just immediately came to mind. It seemed relatively simple. It fit the head shape that I kind of already had on the page. The only thing that I really had left to do here was to make some decisions about whether or not I wanted to use the traditional suit or that, Superman Return from the Dead black suit, which ultimately I did decide on. And also this adjustment that I made on the composition here, where I kind of flipped the image, or gave it a mirror image, if you will, and gave it just, I think, a little bit more, better weight on the page, so to speak. I composed this a little bit better by moving him over to the right-hand side and flipping the image. Now, I'm going in and I'm doing some of my final ink work right now before I get into coloring phase, and if you haven't noticed yet, the S shield is backwards, so I'm making the effort to correct that now, since I did that little flip of the image there. And now that it's corrected, the inking is going to go a lot faster, a lot smoother, and again, the coloring will come into effect pretty quickly after that. Now, this is one of those pieces that, again, lent itself more to portraiture instead of caricature. So one of the things that I tried to do, at least as much as reasonably possible, was to try to hide some of the line work. I didn't hide it all. Some of it's still there where I think it was helpful to kind of emphasize some of the borders of the picture. But wherever possible, especially where there was a bright light source or something like that, I either tried to blend the line work in or just eliminate it altogether by erasing it to help give it, again, more 3D presence on the page. The idea of cartoonish caricature allows those bold outlines, but if I'm moving more towards portraiture and subtle shadows, I kind of feel like the line work detracts from what I'm trying to accomplish in the end. So trying to make some attempts to hide that line work is something that I don't always do, but I definitely wanted to make sure that I took care of on this piece. Now, one of the reasons I think that's really important is to get into some discussion about some of the coloring that I've done with the flesh tones. So to put this out there, I'll let you know that I have a whole lot of videos that speak to the coloring method, how I render light and shadow, and I'm not going to rehash that all on this video. If you'd like to see some information about that or some other videos that I have, I encourage you to check out either my John Wick series. That's a good series to take a look at that. There's also a Rick and Morty series I did where I kind of break everything down real time and show you how I get from sketch to final product, and I'll put a link up in the upper right hand corner for that so you can check it out. But as far as speaking to the coloring on the Superman piece, I'll just mention a couple little bullet points, but not speak to the entire method itself. Again, you have some other videos for that if you need it. As far as this Superman piece, one of the things you may notice right off the bat is the red that I've included in the flesh tone. Something I've spoken to before, especially in the face. There are areas in the face where the blood comes very close to the surface of the skin, and adding a little tone of red really breathes some life into your character if you're working with human beings. Notice the red kind of goes on the tips of the ears, certainly around the lips, bridge of the nose, forehead, and the cheekbones, and I also used it for a little bit of a shadow effect under the neck. Now that's the stuff that's pretty typical, and you will see a little bit later on I'll also even add some blue shades around his jawline to kind of give a mimic of a 5 o'clock shadow. But what I think is particularly interesting here with the reds and the blues is how I'm using them to render the hands. Now hands, I've admitted over and over again, are one of the more toughest things that I work with when I deal with anatomy and human beings. I'm not very talented at hands. I'm fascinated by them. They can conform and contort themselves into infinite possibilities, and the way the shadows and light fall on them can really make it very easy to make a very good-looking hand or a very bad-looking hand just in an instant with one small paint stroke or one small pencil stroke. I'm pretty proud of the hands that I have here, although you haven't seen them in their finished state yet. They'll get there pretty soon. But one of the things that really kind of helps sell this sense of three-dimensionality, especially with the hand that's wrapped around the red necktie, is where those shadows lay and where small little highlights of light can kind of pick out things like a knuckle or the tip of a finger or something similar. I really kind of spent some time more experimenting than knowing exactly where some of these shades of color would go. And one of the things I might recommend is something that I do quite a bit with coloring, where I go back and forth between a little bit of shadow and then go back with a little bit of light and move back and forth until I get something of a balance achieved that looks right to me when I look at it on the page. Once I'd accomplished something that I was relatively happy with in the hands, the decision then became whether or not to keep the lines, especially around the knuckles and around the outlines of the fingers. Again, I mentioned this before, I did make some attempt to eliminate a lot of these lines. I was relatively happy with the result, but I feel like at this point those bold black lines do nothing but detract from a lot of the rendering that I've already been able to accomplish. And because it detracts, it makes the hands look less realistic, less three-dimensional on the page. Now, as you remember, I spent a long time doing rendering on the face to get those subtleties of shadow. I did something similar with the hands, and you can see where I'm kind of bringing some of that into the foreground, so to speak, now. So if I spent all this time really trying to understand where the bold light would go and where the shadow would go and how to blend those together and get appropriate areas to render illusions of three-dimensionality, then the outline is only going to detract from this or distract from it, and I don't want to put all that effort into it just to have it wasted by bold outlines that just don't seem to fit or stay in place. There's a long way of explaining why I wanted to get rid of the line work, but I think that now that you're seeing some of it starting to disappear and get rendered, it may start to make a little bit more sense. So you can see where we had that bold light source coming in on the right-hand side of his jawline there. Having a bold black outline there would almost seem like there was a bold light source, but then this teeny shadow sitting right next to it. So it just didn't make sense to have that line there. Now that it's gone, you can see that this makes a little bit more sense on the page. You can see now that I've done something similar with the lines on the jacket, and especially the hands that I was just talking about a couple minutes ago. And take a look at that contrast between some of the realism that's involved in the hands and some of the less than realistic take that's done on the tie, because it still has those bold black outlines around it. So I kind of went back and forth, putting them back in, taking them back out, making some decisions as to whether or not these bold outlines would either stay or go, or even just stay but be rendered in a different color. That's some of the trick I was able to pull off on the hand. You can see some of those lines were just kind of rendered in something of a whitish pale flesh color. So the line's still there, but you still get the illusion of the three-dimensionality in the hand. And some of those bold outlines that are done in the white, to represent the light source, are really kind of emboldened by the background that we put in at the end there, just to kind of help bring in a little bit more contrast. Something similar was done with the hair. We put in a little bit of line work in there, just to give that illusion of light shining off of it a little bit. But I did want some nice bold black in here to represent that bold blackness of that Superman hair that we're used to. And then as something of a last touch, I thought I'd try giving him the red glowing eyes, just to see if I can get him that kind of pissed off look. So let's take a little bit of a trip through this and see how the whole thing came about. We started with a rough sketch. We moved into something of a more formalized take on light and shadow, a value study, if you will. Once we got done with that, moving then into our final composition, and then inking it. Once the inking phase is done, we can go in and put in our base colors. Just a simple representation of what the root colors of our piece would be, and then follow that up by rendering light and shadow and bring this whole thing to its conclusion. So, I hope that was helpful to you. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat. Don't forget, subscribe, like, share, and I hope to see you again soon. Come on back to the channel, I got some new stuff coming. Thanks again for stopping by, and have a good day.